What's up, everybody, and welcome back in as we are diving back into Chad Daybell. The medical examiner testifies from Utah. We're going to look at what her experience is, how that compares to the coroner, and how she slams the door shut on the vast majority of arguments the defense has been making throughout this entire trial. So buckle up because I think this is some of the evidence we've been waiting for 23 days. So, as we followed this case, the state continues to stack up evidence. They continue to tell their story. A lot of the evidence is consistent and fits into what that story is. But there has been some doubt or gray areas with Tammy Daybell. I think they've continued to chip away at it, but it's not as strong or consistent of evidence, in my opinion, as it is with the kids and some of the other parts of the case. And some of that has to do with the coroner's report initially that said it was a death of natural causes or it was not a homicide. But we heard about some of the lack of experience from that coroner, and we've also heard some other medical testimony. But today we heard from the deputy medical examiner in Utah that I think was potentially the best witness on this topic. And we're going to start by listening to her background and experience. I usually skip that stuff because it's kind of a boring part of trials. We try to do our recaps, in under an hour here and hit the highlights, but I think it's really important here. So I want to listen to 2 or 3 minutes of it together so you guys can get the gist just how competent and experienced she is. You're going to recognize some names where she's trained. And again, we're comparing that to the coroner who had some bad evidence for the state. And Chad Daybell's lawyer, John Pryor, I thought actually did a really good job on her cross to poke a lot of holes and make me think, gosh, are they really going to prove this beyond a reasonable doubt? Well, this witness kind of comes to the rescue of the state. They knew she was coming. They've presented their case in order methodically, and they get to her today, and it doesn't hurt that Ms. Blake is handling her direct examination.
Dr. Marsden, where are you currently employed?
I'm currently employed at the Utah Office of the Medical Examiner.
What is your title or position?
Right now, I am the Deputy Chief Medical Examiner.
How long have you worked in that position?
In this position, I've been the Deputy Chief for approximately a year. So I was also the Forensic Pathology Fellow during my training year and then was an Assistant Medical Examiner after that.
Prior to working at the Office of the Utah Medical Examiner, did you have other experience as a pathologist?
Yes.
What was that?
So I was the autopsy pathologist and medical director for Northwestern University in Chicago, Illinois.
Heard of them, right?
Do you have any specialized training in order to be a forensic pathologist?
I do.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So the training to become a forensic pathologist starts with an undergraduate degree in college. After that, we go to medical school and finish a 4-year medical degree. We then receive a training program in anatomic and clinical pathology, which is 4 years. After that, I additionally did a year of pediatric and perinatal pathology in Chicago before starting as an autopsy pathologist for Northwestern. And then I did a year of forensic pathology fellowship training after that before starting as a forensic pathologist.
Now compare that to the elected coroner who has some emergency services training, and I don't mean to downplay her or make her look bad or anything, but this person is obviously significantly more qualified, experienced, and a much better witness. I'll say that too, just right off the jump.
And when you worked at Northwestern as a pathologist, was it in a different capacity than what you do now?
Yes.
And can you explain a little bit about that?
So at Northwestern, there is a significant difference between hospital autopsy and forensic autopsy. So with hospital autopsies, our primary goal is to diagnose the natural disease processes that people have when they die in a hospitalized setting. And so I was doing autopsies both on fetuses, neonates, and adults who had been admitted to the hospital or had died in a medical setting.
At some point while working at the Office of the Utah Medical Examiners, are you aware of that office being contacted by Fremont County, Idaho law enforcement?
Yes,
And did you end up attending an exhumation of Tammy Daybell?
I did.
So she attended it, worked on it, and we're going to get some of her opinions here at the end. But before we get to her opinions, in case you don't think there's that big of a difference, between her and the coroner, she is going to explain some of those differences here before she gets into nuking literally every single one of the defense's arguments. Whoops, jumped ahead a little too much.
An autopsy, do you consider additional factors in whether or not an autopsy should be conducted?
Yeah, go through medical training.
Did it have an impact on your ability to determine the manner of death?
No.
And Have you ever, are you familiar with the coroner systems?
Yes.
And can you explain a little bit about the difference between a coroner and a medical examiner?
Sure. So a medical examiner is a forensic pathologist. So they are physicians who go through medical training and then specialized training in pathology and forensic pathology to do what they do. Coroners are often either elected or appointed to a position where they are in some ways doing the same thing as a medical examiner, but not always with the same level of education.
And in your experience,
Very nice way of saying we do similar things, but one person is a lot more specialized and educated and experienced and able to do that job a little bit better to a higher level. But I don't think she was disrespectful at all. But if a jury's listening closely and they listen to her background compared to the coroner's, they're going to see and hear a difference,
is it fair to say coroners don't even have to have any medical training?
In some places, they do not.
which is wild.
And you work in Utah, correct?
Correct.
And is that a medical examiner system?
Yes.
Are you, as part of that office, tasked with determining whether or not an autopsy should be conducted?
Yes.
And does that include for unattended deaths?
Yes.
Can you explain what an unattended death is?
So in Utah, an unattended death is an individual who passes away when they are not under the routine care of a physician. So in Utah, we consider attended deaths if you are being treated for a lethal chronic medical condition within a year of you passing away. So if you have not seen a doctor for a year and pass away at home, that would be considered an unattended death, and those would be considered the jurisdiction of our office.
When you're determining whether or not to get an autopsy, do you consider additional factors?
Yes,
Does that include police reports?
it can.
Can it include witness statements?
Yes.
Does it include medical records?
Yes.
In regards to Tammy Daybell, did you in fact look at those types of documents?
Some of them before the autopsy and then additional afterwards.
And I talked about in terms of requesting an autopsy, do you also look at those in assisting in determining a cause and manner of death?
Absolutely.
And did you do that in this case?
Yes.
So this is something the defense has tried to poo-poo or almost seem like something shady is going on. I love how the prosecution just went straight for it, asks the witness a question. The witness has confident answers. The defense is going to hit this on cross too, and we'll see how it goes for him. But I like the way they just directly went right into other factors can be important. The context, the circumstances, the story around what happened.
Can you tell us a little bit about what rigor mortis is?
So rigor mortis is like lividity, again, a postmortem change. So when you stop breathing, all the oxygen that's currently in the body gets used up by your muscles until your muscles become stiff. And then once that happens, you usually continue to stay stiff until decomposition starts to break that down.
Are you able to determine a specific time of death based on rigor mortis?
No.
Does it assist in providing a time frame?
It could.
If a body is described as stiff and cold, would that indicate anything to you?
If they are being described as stiff and cold, what I would consider is that they've likely been deceased for a couple hours, but I would also be asking more questions of my investigators. What do you mean by stiff? Is it stiff in just her jaw? Is it stiff in her arms and her legs and her hips? Because that stiffening happens as a progression, starting with the smaller muscles and then going to the larger muscles. And so I would be asking my investigator more specifically, what are you meaning by stiff? And then that would give me more of a time frame that I can work with. But if somebody just says stiff to me, I would usually say a couple hours, but I can't be more specific than that.
And in the case of Tammy Daybell, is it fair to say you were not on scene initially when her death was reported?
No.
When we talk about those bruises on Tammy's body, if someone's stiff or been dead for a few hours, would something cause bruising to the body at that point?
Judge, speculation, objection.
She's an expert. I'm asking her expert opinion.
So ruled.
Sorry, will you repeat the question?
Yes. If someone's been described as stiff and potentially dead for a few hours, would you expect that body to be bruised by some kind of external factor at that point?
Not at that point.
Okay. So we're starting to answer the bruise question. I'm not sure that fully hits at the heart of it, but we're going to get more into it.
And when we talk about the various ways that asphyxia can occur, can some of those not leave any external signs?
Absolutely.
Can some of them not leave very many internal signs?
Absolutely.
That's important. And I love an answer like absolutely. That's what that says to me is looking over at the defense lawyer and say, bring it. Because I'm not worried about whatever questions you have. I'm positive about this answer and I'm confident. I'm the doctor. So if you want to argue medicine with me, that's fine. We're not going to yell at each other. But she says, absolutely, there are ways where someone can die of asphyxia without external or even internal signs. And if you're wondering on what ways, oh, just wait.
Is one of the internal signs of asphyxiation the pulmonary edema?
It can be.
And so what we saw that we've talked about, can that be one of the internal signs? We're not saying there are no signs in this case, but it can happen that way. However, we do have some things that are signs, right? Like this. And she says, yes, that can be one.
And in this case, did you review some medical records associated with Tammy Daybell?
I did.
Did you see anything in the medical records that would explain her sudden death?
No.
Do you recall seeing any?
She reviewed the medical records, and we've heard John Pryor ask all sorts of questions about family history and about falling and dizziness, and um, she was anemic. And all these questions that like don't seemingly have anything to do with why she would die, vomiting, whatever. Well, this doctor with all of that training looked through her records and saw nothing in her records that would be concerning or you would expect somebody to die. Now, somebody can just die. Crazy things happen, incredibly tragic things happen where we can't always explain it. Some natural causes that are unexplainable or surprise even medical professionals, that can happen. And that may still be something the jury sees in this case. But her confident answer is no, nothing in those records leads me to believe that they were a reason for her passing.
Anything in the medical records about seizure activity?
No.
Do you recall seeing anything about low blood pressure?
Nothing that was reported as a diagnosis. I did review her vital signs for multiple medical visits in probably the decade before she passed away. And she had some low normal blood pressure readings, but it was never discussed as a problem with her physician.
And would you expect someone that had a prior history of anemia to just suddenly pass away?
No.
Would you, or in your experience, expect someone using homeopathic medicines or remedies to just suddenly pass away?
No.
And
We
again,
heard blood pressure, anemia, seizures, homeopathic medication, everything Pryor's been throwing at all these witnesses to try to throw reasonable doubt. And one by one, Ms. Blake lines them up and this doctor knocks them down. And now there's evidence that every single one of the arguments the defense is making is not actually something that points in the opposite direction of asphyxia. This doctor considered every single one of these defense arguments and still comes down with her opinion that we're going to hear at the end of her direct examination. That's why this is so important. The state is not afraid to throw every single thing out there. And I think this is why they called the coroner. So we get the coroner out of the way, let them hear the coroner because this hammer was coming later. Don't hide the coroner and then let the defense call them later in the case and then be like, maybe a reasonable doubt. No, coroner first. And then some other, I think it was another medical examiner that we've heard from already, but this was the key witness in my opinion.
in your prior
The
work
last medical examiner I thought was good. This witness I thought was great.
at Northwestern, would you have been conducting autopsies that would have been attended deaths?
Yes,
And those would be deaths where someone was under the care of a doctor
exactly.
and deaths where someone had some kind of a medical issue?
Yes.
Which is what they're trying to say happened to Tammy Daybell, the defense.
And I asked you about those bruises and not expecting to see them on a body that had been deceased for a few hours. Can you explain a little bit about why you wouldn't expect to see bruising?
So when a person passes away, blood stops flowing through your vessels. And the reason why a bruise occurs in a living person is a force causes rupture of the blood vessels under the skin. And because your heart is pumping blood, the blood is exiting those ruptured vessels and accumulating in those tissues under the skin. So that is what causes a bruise. So a person who's deceased, who doesn't have blood pressure, who doesn't have blood circulating through their system, if those blood vessels are ruptured from a trauma after somebody is deceased, there's not going to be a lot of blood that is leaking out into the tissues because there's not blood flowing through those vessels.
Makes sense.
And so again, the bruises on Tammy in this case, you determined would have occurred sometime around her time of death.
True.
I don't feel like there was like a very long, huge medical explanation for that, but she said yes. I don't know. I mean, again, because of her experience and her testimony thus far, she's the witness I trust the most to answer these questions. I would have liked a little bit more of an explanation than what she said about the timing of it and how the blood flow is different at your time of death. I don't really know why they couldn't have been there before. Because I mean, bruises, the look of bruises on the exterior of your skin could have happened days or even weeks sometimes for people that bruise easily or bruises stay long, could be there and you could visibly see them. So not really positive I follow, but she gives the state what they need evidence-wise.
And you talked about asphyxia kind of essentially getting there by ruling other causes out. Is that fair?
Yes.
When we talk about the seizures, any indication in Tammy's medical history that made you think that was a plausible explanation or likely cause of her death?
No. And there's a number of reasons why I think seizures are an extremely unlikely and unplausible explanation for her death. So most people who have a seizure disorder and who die of their seizure disorder, they are not minor shaking fits. They're not minor seizures that these people are having. They're usually grand mal shaking seizures that are not subtle. And so to not have a history of any type of seizure like that and to suddenly develop it as a 49-year-old woman with no explanation in the brain for a seizure focus just does not make any sense.
So she's like, it doesn't make any sense. based on her history, based on what happens to people that actually pass from seizures, that have them seriously, and it seriously affects their life. This doesn't make any sense. So again, we're knocking off seizures again, and we're knocking off the bruises as arguments for the defense.
And then talking a little more about the cardia arrhythmia, did you see anything in Tammy's medical history or with her heart that would lead you to believe that was a likely cause of death or plausible?
No, Tammy's heart was completely normal at the time of examination.
Knock it down.
And then we talked about the different manners of death. Did you consider undetermined as a potential option?
We did.
What did you ultimately determine the manner of death to be?
It was homicide,
And again, the cause of death?
asphyxia.
And if I may have just one moment.
Manner of death, homicide. Cause of death, asphyxia. After considering all the defense arguments, after reading all of her medical records, after looking at the coroner's report and what the coroner did, after exhuming the body and doing her own investigation, after looking at all the other circumstances surrounding this, which we're going to dig into them more on cross, what does she come down? Homicide by asphyxia.
I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Once you're ready,
Of what day Tammy died, and are you aware that whether or not they reburied her the same regarding this matter?
I was not, the office was.
Do you have a recollection or knowledge as to when they contacted your office? Circumstances were you referring to?
I'm skipping some of the who was noted or who was notified about her exhumation, things like that. Because I want to get to one of the first questions he asks, which blows my mind. He talks about suspicious circumstances and how those can cause you to exhume a body or do an autopsy or whatever it may be, and how it didn't happen early in this case. And he actually asks her, well, what suspicious circumstances? That opens the door for her to be like, this death and that death and his connection to Lori Vallow. And we'll hear how she answers it right in front of the jury from Pryor's question, which I actually thought the state should have asked this question almost.
Involved in that process at the time.
You mentioned the subject of suspicious circumstances as to why they exhumed her body. You testified that because of the suspicious circumstances. What suspicious circumstances were you referring to?
The ones that we were told was that there were some missing children that had been reported by other family members, and that the decedent's husband had recently remarried a person who was being, who people were saying they were in a relationship with before she had passed away.
Now, while lawyers may think that's an aha moment, you never thought there was anything wrong until he was getting married to Lori Vallow. It's like, okay, but most lay people are probably like, yeah, the fact that he married Lori Vallow days after Tammy died and saying she was going to die and calling her dark, that is suspicious. We should look at this again. And if it comes up snake eyes and there's nothing there, fine. But most lay people think that that's a good reason to reinvestigate this. And that context and those suspicious circumstances are, I think, what's going to eventually lead them to a guilty verdict. But I get what Pryor's doing, because he's saying it wasn't because of the bruises. It wasn't because of any of her medical records. It wasn't because of any of the reports of her death. There was nothing suspicious about that. It was purely because you didn't like the fact that he was having an affair or got married so quickly afterwards. And while that might be an okay legal argument, I don't think it makes much sense practically.
There wasn't any suspicion regarding what was surrounding actual going on with Tammy Daybell. It was all of the collateral circumstances about Mr. Daybell being in a relationship with another woman and some other matters that were being investigated. Is that correct?
Objection, Your Honor. Counsel's misstating testimony.
sustained.
And move to strike that question.
The question should be stricken, not considered by the jury.
So the circumstances that you spoke about were the investigation of the missing children, correct?
Correct.
And to your knowledge, that had nothing to do with Tammy Daybell. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. The fact that Mr. Daybell and Lori Vallow were in an affair relationship, that didn't reflect any physical signs of any foul play with Tammy Daybell, did it?
It was suspicious mostly because she was a 49-year-old woman who was in good health leading up to her death, which was unexplained by the coroner on the death certificate.
It's like, yeah, the point of the unexplained death, and we don't get it. And there's something weird about it. Whenever something new comes up, it's like, maybe we should revisit this.
But the coroner had explained that there weren't, this wasn't a homicide. You saw that, correct?
Correct.
And the coroner determined that there was no autopsy. They made the determination not to perform an autopsy. Is that correct?
Correct.
Now,
She's not trying to press this witness. She's not trying to give more than she should. She's answering things straightforward. And she does a great job, in my opinion.
occurred on Tammy Daybell's body, correct?
We could give a general time range, but not a specific time.
And even that time range is a subjective determination. Isn't that true?
Yes,
In other words, you can't be certain when those bruises were placed on Tammy's body or how they were placed. Isn't that correct?
correct.
Again,
On
she
the
doesn't try to
subject of heavy
press.
lungs, one of your associates, Dr. Christensen, who you worked with, make a determination that there was
I'm trying. So heavy lungs is not necessarily
but there are underlying medical conditions that can be related a determination that the lungs are heavy. Isn't that true?
There can be, which is why we do microscopic examination of the lungs.
Now, at the time of this autopsy, you were working as a fellow with
Correct.
Dr. Christensen.
Correct.
And was this your first autopsy outside of a laboratory environment?
So he thinks he's got her here. He thinks he's got her on her experience, that she's actually not that experienced. This is one of her first ones. Let's hear how this goes for John Pryor.
No,
Okay. How many autopsies had you done prior to this?
approximately 500.
Oops. You can call her a fellow, but like if you listen to her experience in education, it's like 4 years here, 4 years there, 1 year here, 4 years there. So some of these doctors are in school forever and they've got tons of experience, even if they are a fellow. And this doctor had done 500, she's been a part of 500 autopsies at this time. I don't care who you are. If you're sitting there on the jury and you're not a doctor yourself who does this, that seems like a lot. And just from her testimony and her background and resume, I'm probably going to believe what she's going to say. And this is where Pryor's like arguing the medicine with the doctor. And we as lawyers are almost always going to lose if it's a good doctor, good witness.
And were those autopsies all under the supervision of another physician or medical examiner?
No, only the ones that I performed at the office of the medical examiner.
Oops.
The foam continued, or it was that way when she was prepared for burial, correct?
Correct.
You talked about natural causes of death, and you said pulmonary and seizures. I recall. Again, could you describe to me what are the natural causes of death that could be unexplained in a situation like this?
So the natural causes of death that you would think about when you have a quote negative autopsy, an autopsy where there's no discernible cause of death, are going to be things like seizures or cardiac heart rhythm disorders.
Right. And when you're talking about, and then I wrote down pulmonary because it's heart rhythm disorders. Maybe that was my shortcut. Heart rhythm disorders. When you have a situation where there's no identifiable cause of death, including a completely healthy heart, you can still have cardiac arrhythmias, correct?
You can.
And you could still have a manner of death that included the heart just stopping its functioning process without any explanation as to the whether there's damage to the heart or not, correct?
Correct.
So when we talk about foam, and I was about to say the stomach again, but when we talk about foam that was in the airways and the lungs, one of the indications of foam, isn't it true, is that the heart stops and doesn't provide enough oxygen to the body, and the result is a significant amount of foam.
Usually it's that the heart isn't functioning appropriately for an extended period of time that's leading to respiratory failure, which is causing accumulation of fluid in the lungs. Usually when you have a sudden cardiac death, you don't have enough time for that pulmonary edema to develop because your lungs are essentially stopping at the same time that your heart is stopping.
So if I understand you correctly, then that if there's a sign that the heart isn't working properly, regardless of whether there's signs or not, though of an unhealthy heart, that's when you're going to get that foam situation, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So I guess my question is this, is that if in fact Tammy Daybell's heart was immediately stopped by compression or asphyxiation, that's an immediate stopping of the heart. Why is there foam in her system then?
He thinks he's got her again. The medical question, it's like, aha, doesn't the foam prove your theory is wrong?
Well, asphyxia isn't going to immediately stop the heart. The heart will stop once it's not able to get enough oxygen to continue to pump. And that's going to take minutes if a person is being asphyxiated. And then
She's like, no, actually, that fits in perfectly. Let me explain it to you real quick.
that will allow time for the lungs to start to fail and fluid to accumulate.
Or it could be that the heart wasn't functioning properly and it stopped and foam developed within her system as a result of a heart that wasn't working properly, correct?
So what you're describing is congestive heart failure. And in that case, when we look at the lungs under the microscope, we see other evidence of congestive heart failure, which is usually old bleeding into the lungs from leaky vessels, which causes macrophages or the inflammatory cells to come in and clean it up. And that was not seen in her. So this was not a congestive heart failure.
When you come up
It's like, sure, it could, except that it didn't here because we did more investigation, which showed that that was not the case.
with a determination that the death is undetermined and there's absolutely no signs, let's say there's no bruising, let's say there is nothing indicating any sort of cause of death, and yet we have someone who's passed away, you make an undetermined, that in that situation, without any signs or any other collateral information, you make a determination that
Without any other information, even though you might have other information in this case,
it's an undetermined death, correct?
If you have no other collateral information, investigative information that leads you to any other conclusion.
And when you make a determination of
it's like, but that's not what we have here. That's the issue. Then I'm going to skip ahead a little bit more because he does a great job of getting her to go through all the ways you can have asphyxiation without some of the other signs that we may not have in this case. And she goes through and literally explains the way somebody could do this to somebody who could fit into exactly what the state's theory of this case is. This is cross-examination that she gets this information out on.
Her past as to whether or not there's any family history of any, would you call that?
I do.
Okay. Now, on the issue of asphyxia, you talked about the bruises on her arms, and the vast majority of them were on the right arm. Is that correct?
Correct.
There were a number of them that you're claiming are bruises were on the right arm, and then one on the left, right?
Yes.
And then a mark on her chest. Okay. So you talked about what you claim are the 4 levels of asphyxia, and the first one you mentioned would have been exclusion of oxygen by way of choking, correct?
It could be exclusion of oxygen by anything.
Now, in Tammy Daybell's situation, there was no sign of any broken or malfunctioning airway that had been blocked physically. Is that correct?
Correct.
You didn't see any damage to the neck or the throat or any of the, and I'm going to hack the bone that's called the heat.
The hyoid?
Thank you. I'll never get it right. I could practice and I'll never get it right. That wasn't cracked or broken or anything like that, correct?
No, there was damage to the muscles on the right because of the embalming process. So we weren't able to do a full examination, but there was nothing on the left.
Okay. And then you talked the second one would have been neck compression.
Yes.
And there were no indications of any bruising or fingerprints or marks suggesting that Tammy Daybell was choked or someone had squeezed her neck to cause her to die that way, correct?
Correct.
So he's making some good points here. Now, I probably would have objected. The state sometimes do with his hand motions of, doing all this. It's kind of like him testifying, but they didn't, and he was able to do it. And I think that's a good point. But just wait, because he's going to open the door for her to walk through it.
And then the next one you mentioned was chemical asphyxiation, and there's no indication. You did an extensive review of potential chemicals that could have caused this, correct?
Correct.
And the only thing you came up with was the fluoxetine, which was the medication she was taking, correct?
Correct.
And did you do a cross check as to whether or not any of these homeopathic or any of these essential oils or other items could potentially interact in a way that could cause her some medical issues?
So most of the essential oils and homeopathic medications that are out there have low overdose potential. There's still a potential for overdose, but because of that, testing for those things is not offered in most reference labs. And so we wouldn't have been able to rule any of that out, but there was no evidence at the scene that she was overtaking any of these things.
Okay. And you don't know the quantity of those homeopathic medicines or the oils or the other things that she was taking, correct?
No.
And if you were to make a determination and you did have that, would that aid you in maybe considering that as a possible option?
It could.
Now, the last one you mentioned was a mechanical asphyxiation. And I don't know if this one falls into the subject of you cover up the mouth or you cover up the chest physically with something to stop the breathing. Is that what that is about?
So exclusion of oxygen would be something that covers the mouth, covers the nose or airway. So that would be like a suffocation. With mechanical asphyxia, we see mechanical asphyxias very frequently. And so the classic situation is somebody who's working under their car and the car jack fails and the car falls on the chest and then the chest is no longer able to rise. Those people die of a mechanical asphyxia.
And the type of asphyxia you're talking about is the stoppage of the breathing. Tammy Daybell, someone was trying to stop. That's what you're suggesting, is someone was trying to stop Tammy Daybell from breathing, physically covering up her airway. Is that correct?
Correct.
So explain to me, with the bruises on the arms, did you see any scratches on the fingers or any sign of any DNA under the fingers?
So in this case, she had been prepared for burial. She had been washed, cleaned, and there was also mold on her fingers from the internment. So at this point, there would be no trace evidence.
And there were no scratches of any kind that would indicate any kind of a struggle. Is that correct?
Correct.
Nothing, in fact, to indicate any kind of a struggle, correct?
The bruises could indicate a struggle, but it's again nonspecific.
And when you say non-specific, we don't know how those bruises got there, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So if someone's holding Daybell's breathing, that same person then at the same time would be holding her arms down as well?
Or there's more than one person. I don't know.
Okay. But the suggestion is that you're saying someone was stopping her breathing, and potentially there could be another person there who's restraining the arms. Is that what you're suggesting?
I'm not suggesting anything, but that is a possibility.
Okay. You talked a little bit about rigor mortis, and when you have an
Very interesting, right? Could be smothered with a pillow, something put on their chest. Somebody could hold their arms down. Could have been 2 people. Could have done it at the same time. All different ways where this lines up exactly with what the state's theory is. Now, because of that discussion, Ms. Blake was able to come up on redirect and ask some more questions that are very helpful to the state's case.
Dr. Marsden, you were just asked about the stomach contents. You recall that question?
Yes.
Do contents in the stomach tell you anything one way or the other if someone's thrown up?
No.
And you talked about seeing remnants of potatoes and peanuts. Is that what you recall?
That's what it appeared to be.
Did it appear to be a Big Mac?
No.
You were asked about learning that Tammy had dizzy spells or fainting spells. Do you recall that question?
Yes.
Do you recall where that information came from?
That information was from the police report, which was obtained from her husband.
So the only information regarding dizzy or fainting spells came from Chad Daybell.
Correct.
Anything in the medical records that indicated dizziness or fainting spells?
No.
Did it surprise you not to see Tammy's family at the exhumation?
No.
And you were asked about some of the suspicious circumstances involving some missing kids. Do you recall that?
Yes.
So here's where she's just going to run right through all the stuff he brought up on cross again. She mentioned, but I think it's even better detailed in cross and on redirect.
Did you learn that those missing kids were Chad's new wife's kids?
Yes, I think I knew that.
And Tammy Daybell was Chad's recently deceased wife.
Yes.
With regard to this idea of heavy lungs, did you find any signs of a medical condition which would cause heavy lungs?
No.
Did you believe that to play into a cause of death in this case?
I think that it is the result of the cause of death, but it is not itself the cause of death.
In looking at the history, Tammy's medical history and her family's medical history that was noted in her records, any concerns in relation to Tammy's heart based on that?
No, and her records we specifically asked did not include any sudden cardiac deaths in young individuals in her family that would indicate a genetic cause of heart disease.
And counsel went over with you again, death by essentially asphyxiation by exclusion of oxygen. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Are there ways that someone can cause someone else's death in that manner without leaving any signs or external injuries?
Absolutely.
That's what they opened the door for. Let's talk about it. How can you do it without external and internal injuries? Even though there are some, there are circumstances where there might be none, and it could still be death by asphyxia. Now, is that enough for beyond a reasonable doubt? You guys tell me in the comments.
Someone else's death in that manner without leaving any signs or external injuries.
Absolutely.
Are you aware of some of the mechanisms or way a person could asphyxiate someone else without leaving those signs when we're talking about the exclusion of oxygen category?
Yes.
What are those?
This would include things like smothering with a pillow, putting
Which a lot of people think that's kind of what happened here. Now, we don't know that, but from this testimony and a lot of the medical testimony that we've heard, that seems to be the way it probably happened. And they don't have to prove exactly how he did it, just that he did it. And will that be enough? You guys let me know.
a bag over the head, putting a weight on the chest so that the chest can't rise. These are all potential things that would not necessarily leave any sign.
And the last one, the weight on the chest, would be mechanical asphyxiation? Would it
Yes.
fall into that? And you were asked about the bruises and indicated, it could indicate there was more than one person there. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Could it also indicate someone kneeling on a chest and holding someone down?
Yes.
And the reason all this is proper to get into these detailed, specific, different ways it could happen is because of the defense's cross, in my opinion.
In reviewing possible causes of death, what did you determine in relation to a seizure as a possible cause?
That it is extremely unlikely and improbable.
What did you determine with regard to cardiarrhythmia as a cause?
The same, extremely unlikely and improbable.
And again, ultimately, what did you determine the cause to be?
Asphyxia,
And what did you determine the manner to be?
homicide.
In your experience, or would it be fair to say that dead bodies don't generally roll out of bed?
True.
I have no further questions.
All right.
Again, I mean, she is real. She's one of my favorite prosecutors I've seen in a trial we've watched together because she does a good job. She hit all the defense's points. She caught the big door opening, walked through it, and then she had her ending prepared to, again, line up the seizures, the cardiac, all the arguments the defense have been making. So this witness could knock them all down and then again say homicide by asphyxia. I thought this was like an A+ direct and redirect of very important evidence that we needed to see in the charges that include Tammy Daybell. But I want to know what you guys thought as potential jurors. I want to know what you guys thought as lay people that could literally be sitting on this jury in your jurisdiction. Because I, as a lawyer, I follow a lot of the lawyering. I see the technical things and how they're doing this, how they're doing that. But how does it come across to you? Let me know in the comments as the state continues to build this case against Chad Daybell. I think they're doing a pretty good job of getting rid of that cloak of presumption of innocence and proving this case beyond a reasonable doubt. I am doing my best to keep an open mind and wait until the entire case and all the evidence is done, but they are certainly building. So hit that like button if you guys haven't already, and make sure you subscribe to our page. I appreciate you joining me. Till next time, I am out of here. Thanks for watching another episode of The Lawyer You Know. If you enjoyed the episode, please hit the thumbs up and share with your friends who may be interested here on YouTube. And don't forget to subscribe. You can also follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok. And don't forget to check out the Lawyer You Know podcast with new seasons dropping every quarter. If you have a case you want to talk to us about, if it's a personal injury case, wrongful death, catastrophic injury, car accident, or slip and fall case, please email us at lawyeryouknow@gmail.com. And of course, all these links I just mentioned are included in the description below on this episode and every episode. So until next time, this is Peter Tragos, the Lawyer You Know.